A cloaked figure moves through a moonlit courtyard, leaving coins in the hands of the desperate. This is not just a simple act of charity. It is the work of a medieval almoner. These men and women stood at the very center of a world defined by faith, power, and secret ambition. By the end of this journey, you will know the hidden stories of 30 renowned almoners who shaped history from the shadows. What drove a queen to wash the feet of lepers, and why did a king's generosity nearly bankrupt his kingdom? What kind of person dedicates their life to the quiet distribution of hope? Long before he was a jolly figure in a red suit, St. Nicholas was a 4th century bishop in the ancient city of Myra. His story begins not at the North Pole, but in the heart of the Roman Empire, where his role as an almoner was both a spiritual duty and a source of immense soft power. He understood that charity could speak louder than any decree. The most famous tale, the one that echoes through the centuries, involves 3 young sisters and their destitute father. With no money for a dowry, the girls faced a future of slavery or starvation, their prospects as bleak as a winter night. Nicholas, learning of their plight, took action in secret. On 3 separate occasions, under the cover of darkness, he tossed a pouch of gold coins through their open window. Each bag landed safely, some say in a stocking left to dry by the fire, providing each sister with the means for a secure marriage and a life of dignity. This was not a public spectacle. It was a clandestine mission of mercy, a signature act that defined the almoner's preference for anonymous, effective aid over public praise. But his influence extended far beyond nighttime deliveries. As a bishop, Nicholas' charitable network gave him a powerful platform within the early church. His generosity built loyalty among the common people, which in turn translated into significant political influence. He attended the Council of Nicaea, a pivotal moment in Christian history, and legends even claim he physically confronted a heretic there, so fierce was his defense of the faith. His sainthood was cemented not just by miracles, but by this very model of combining spiritual authority with discreet, impactful charity. He set the template, proving that an almoner could be a formidable force, shaping souls and society from the ground up. The quiet, secretive charity of St. Nicholas found a powerful echo in the life of another future saint, a Roman soldier named Martin. One bitterly cold night near the city gate of Amiens, his path crossed with a half-naked beggar shivering in the wind. Moved by compassion, Martin did not hesitate. He drew his sword, sliced his heavy military cloak in 2, and gave half to the desperate man. That single, spontaneous act, carved out with a soldier's blade, would define him for all time. It was a perfect, physical symbol of almsgiving, a direct transfer of warmth and dignity from one human to another. That very night, he dreamed of Jesus Christ himself wearing the half-cloak, telling the angels, "Martin, who is still a catechumen, clothed me with this robe." This divine confirmation shattered his old life, compelling him to leave the army and fully embrace a spiritual path. His military career ended, but a new kind of service was just beginning. Martin's journey did not stop at the city gate. He eventually became Bishop of Tours, and his understanding of charity evolved from individual acts to systemic support. He established one of the first monasteries in Gaul, at Marmoutier, which quickly grew into a major center for charitable work. This was not merely a place of secluded prayer, it was an active hub of mercy. The monastery became a refuge for the poor, the sick, and the weary traveler, institutionalizing the very compassion Martin had shown on the road. Here, his model of charity was replicated and taught, creating a lasting engine of aid that would outlive him. His life became a powerful archetype for the medieval world, symbolizing the profound transition from military service to spiritual service. He exchanged the sword that divided his cloak for the authority of a bishop's crook, proving that true strength lay not in taking lives, but in saving them. It is no surprise he became the patron saint of beggars, a lasting testament to the power of seeing a person in need not as a nuisance, but as a divine opportunity. The quiet humility of Martin's cloak found a royal echo in the stone halls of Norman England. There, a queen knelt not in a chapel, but in a chamber filled with the poor, washing their feet with her own hands. This was Queen Matilda of Scotland, wife to King Henry I. a woman whose profound personal piety was as strategic as it was sincere. Her daily routine was a spectacle of devotion, a deliberate performance that cemented her image as a holy and compassionate ruler. She did not merely donate from a distance. She engaged in the most intimate and humbling act of service, cleansing the feet of beggars in a powerful echo of Christ's own actions. This was charity as theater, and every subject who heard of it was reminded of their queen's saintly virtue. But her compassion built more than just a reputation. It constructed lasting monuments of mercy. She founded leper hospitals, most famously St. Giles in the Fields just outside London, creating dedicated spaces of care for society's most feared and shunned outcasts. These hospitals were not just shelters, they were statements, declaring that even the most wretched were under the Queen's protection. Yet behind this veil of pure charity lay a sharp political mind. Matilda was a descendant of the old Anglo-Saxon kings, marrying into the new Norman dynasty that had conquered her people's land. Her very public charity was a masterstroke of political diplomacy. By embodying the ideal of a pious, generous queen, she helped soften the harsh image of Norman rule, presenting her husband's reign as legitimate, godly, and compassionate. Her almsgiving was a tool to unite a fractured kingdom, weaving threads of loyalty from both the conquered English and the Norman newcomers, securing her family's fragile hold on the throne. Every bowl of water, every coin given, was a brick in the foundation of a dynasty. The royal feet Matilda washed were a prelude to a king who would make such humility a spectacle of state. King Louis IX of France carried his own bowl of water, kneeling not before nobles, but before the poorest of his subjects to wash their feet. For him, this was not a rare ceremony, but a regular practice, a profound act of devotion that he believed was a non-negotiable duty of his crown. He saw himself as the chief servant of his people, and his very public almsgiving was a performance of sacred kingship, designed to mimic the humility of Christ himself. He would personally serve meals to the destitute at his own table, transforming the royal palace into a temporary refuge where the king acted as a humble steward. This was charity as a core component of his identity, a direct and personal investment in his own salvation and the soul of his kingdom. His compassion, however, was not limited to symbolic gestures. Louis had a vision for institutional mercy that would outlive any single act. He founded hospitals and hospices across France, creating a permanent network of care. His most famous foundation was the Quinze Vingt in Paris, a hospice established for 300 blind men, a number which gives the institution its name. This was a revolutionary act of inclusion, providing shelter and purpose for a segment of the population often left to beg and suffer. These institutions were not just buildings, they were a physical extension of the king's own charitable spirit, a lasting legacy of care that was woven into the fabric of the nation. Yet for all its sincerity, this boundless charity was also a brilliant tool of statecraft. In an age where a king's power was measured by his divine favor, Louis's very public piety and generosity presented him as the ideal Christian monarch. His almsgiving was a powerful form of propaganda, broadcasting his virtue across Europe and strengthening his moral authority over his own subjects. By appearing as the most devout and generous ruler of his time, he silenced critics and consolidated his power, making his reign appear to be the will of God made manifest on earth. His charity, therefore, was a double-edged sword, serving both the desperate poor and the absolute authority of the crown, proving that in the medieval world, a bowl of water could be as potent as a royal scepter. But even a saintly king like Louis needed a man to manage his mercy, a figure who understood that charity required not just a pious heart, but a shrewd mind. That man was Abbot Suger of St. Denis, a political mastermind who served as the chief advisor to King Louis VI and VII, and who held the sacred office of Almoner for one of France's wealthiest abbeys. His hands distributed alms on a staggering scale, yet they also drafted royal decrees and sketched the first blueprints for a new style of architecture that would reach for the heavens. How could one man so perfectly embody the contradiction at the heart of medieval almsgiving, the tension between humble service and immense, worldly power? Suger's story begins with the abbey itself, the Royal Abbey of St. Denis, the burial place of French kings. As its almoner and abbot, he was the steward of its vast estates and treasures, a fortune that flowed from lands and pious donations. His duty was to channel this wealth into charitable works, and he did so systematically, feeding the poor and supporting the sick. But for Suger, charity was not an end in itself. It was part of a grander vision. He believed that magnificence in the service of God was a form of devotion, and he poured the abbey's resources into a project that would change Europe, the rebuilding of the ancient basilica in a revolutionary new style we now call Gothic. He funded this monumental endeavor while simultaneously expanding the abbey's charitable distributions, seeing no conflict between feeding the poor and raising a cathedral of unprecedented light and height. Here lies the central mystery of his life. Publicly, he was the humble distributor of alms, the servant of the poor. Privately, he was a consummate political operator, a kingmaker who shaped the destiny of France from the shadows of the royal court. He used his position as almoner to build a network of influence and loyalty that stretched across the kingdom, proving that the distribution of bread could be as politically potent as the distribution of land or titles. His greatest legacy, the Basilica of St. Denis, stands as the ultimate expression of this duality. Its soaring vaults and radiant stained glass windows were funded by the same wealth he gave to the poor, a physical manifestation of his belief that beauty and charity were two sides of the same sacred coin. The light that flooded through those windows was meant to illuminate the soul, just as the bread he distributed was meant to sustain the body. In Abbot Suger, the medieval almoner reached its most complex form, a figure who wielded mercy not just as a key to heaven, but as a lever of earthly power, forever changing the skyline of faith and the very nature of charitable influence. While Abbot Suger balanced charity with grand architecture, another almoner chose a path of radical, personal sacrifice. A princess of Hungary, Elizabeth, moved through the cold corridors of Wartburg Castle with a secret. Beneath her fine robes, she hid loaves of bread, stolen from the royal tables to feed the starving peasants outside the gates. This was not a queen performing a public ritual, but a young woman engaged in a dangerous, clandestine operation of mercy, directly challenging the expectations of her noble station. Her husband, the Landgrave Louis, was said to tolerate her charity, but the courtiers watched her with suspicion, whispering that her behavior was unbecoming of a future ruler. The tension between her divine calling and her earthly duty was a constant, silent war waged within the castle walls. Then came the legendary encounter that would define her sainthood. Suspicious of her daily disappearances, her husband or his brother, depending on the version of the tale, confronted her as she descended toward the village, her cloak suspiciously heavy and bulging. Demanding to know what she concealed, he threw open her mantle, expecting to expose her theft and humiliate her. But instead of the hidden bread, a cascade of fresh, fragrant roses tumbled out onto the frozen ground. It was a miracle, a divine intervention that shielded her work and transformed the evidence of her disobedience into a bouquet of heavenly favor. The roses were not just a beautiful deception, they were a powerful symbol that her charity, though hidden, was blessed and true. This moment of divine protection only deepened her resolve. After her husband's untimely death, she was cast out from the court, stripped of her wealth and status. Yet this exile freed her to pursue her calling without restraint. She used her widow's dower to found a hospital in Marburg, and there, she did not merely oversee its operations, she immersed herself in the most repulsive tasks. Elizabeth personally cared for the sick, washing their sores, comforting the dying, and embracing those afflicted with leprosy. She traded her royal silks for the coarse gray habit of a Franciscan tertiary, finding a higher nobility in service than she had ever known in her birthright. Her life presents a profound mystery. Was her extreme charity a form of divine madness, a rejection of the world she was born to rule? Or was it the ultimate expression of a faith so pure it could not be contained by palace walls? She chose the filth of the hospital over the comfort of the court, finding in the faces of the suffering a purpose that royal privilege could never provide. Her story is the ultimate conflict between the demands of a crown and the call of a conscience, a mystery where roses bloomed from hidden bread, and a princess found her true kingdom among the poor. The story of Elizabeth, trading her castle for a hospital, shows a charity of radical personal surrender. Yet another path existed, one that balanced profound compassion with unyielding political courage. In the stark silence of a Carthusian monastery, a monk named Hugh found his calling not in solitude alone, but in service. He was a man who had become Bishop Hugh of Lincoln, a figure so beloved that even the wild creatures of his episcopal manor seemed to sense his gentle nature. The most famous legend tells of a fierce swan that terrorized everyone at his residence in Stowe Park. This was no graceful bird, but an aggressive creature that would attack anyone who came near. Yet when Hugh arrived, the swan's demeanor completely changed. It approached him without fear or aggression, ate from his hand, and became his constant, loyal companion, following him like a devoted pet. This was not seen as a mere curiosity, but as a divine sign, a testament to a purity of heart so profound it could tame the wildest of natures. It was a public symbol of his inner character, a man whose very presence could bring peace. That same gentle spirit defined his approach to charity. Unlike many high-ranking churchmen who delegated the distribution of alms to servants, Hugh insisted on giving directly. He would personally wash the feet of lepers, feed the hungry with his own hands, and offer comfort to the most shunned and feared members of society. For him, this was not a ceremonial duty performed on holy days, but the daily, practical essence of his pastoral care. He believed that to truly shepherd his flock, he had to touch them, to look into their eyes and share in their suffering. This direct connection built a deep, unbreakable loyalty among the common people, who saw in him a bishop who was truly theirs. But this gentle man possessed a spine of steel. His charity was not separate from his courage, it was the source of it. He famously confronted the formidable King Henry II over a point of principle. The king had seized church property to fund his military campaigns, a common practice that most bishops tolerated out of fear. Hugh refused. He marched into the royal court and demanded restitution, arguing that wealth meant for the poor and for God's work could not be used for war. The king, known for his fiery temper, was enraged, but Hugh stood his ground. He reportedly poked the king in the chest to emphasize his point, a gesture of unbelievable audacity. Yet his moral authority, earned through a lifetime of genuine service, was so immense that the king ultimately relented, returning the land and even, according to accounts, offering Hugh a kiss of peace. This was the political power of a clear conscience, proving that an almoner who feared nothing but God could challenge the most powerful monarch in the land. His posthumous reputation for sanctity was immediate and widespread. Upon his death, the public outpouring of grief was immense. He was quickly venerated as a saint, with countless miracles attributed to his intercession. The legacy of Bishop Hugh answers a profound question about medieval almsgiving. Could charity and political power coexist without one corrupting the other? His life suggests they could, but only when grounded in a humility so real it could tame a swan, and a courage so firm it could stare down a king. He demonstrated that the distribution of alms was not a soft or secondary task, but the very core of an authority that could shape the destiny of a kingdom. Eleanor of Aquitaine's charity was a grand political strategy disguised as piety. As queen to two kings, first of France and then of England, she commanded a territory that dwarfed the domains of her husbands. Her wealth was legendary, and her use of it was a masterclass in medieval statecraft. She did not simply give alms, she invested them with precision, transforming religious houses into pillars of her influence. Her most significant patronage was directed at Fontevraud Abbey, a unique double monastery that housed both monks and nuns. This was not a casual donation. Fontevraud became the spiritual and physical heart of the Plantagenet Empire. Eleanor endowed it with immense riches, ensuring it flourished as a center of prayer and power. In return, the abbey's prayers were dedicated to the salvation of her soul and the souls of her royal lineage, a spiritual insurance policy for the afterlife. But its role was far more earthly as well. Fontevraud served as a royal mausoleum, the final resting place for her husband Henry II, and her son Richard the Lionheart. By anchoring her dynasty's memory there, she cemented her family's legacy in stone and prayer, making the abbey a permanent symbol of Plantagenet authority. Her almsgiving extended far beyond this one institution. As she traveled across her vast lands from Aquitaine to England, she funded hospitals, leper houses, and bridges. Each endowment was a carefully placed stitch in the fabric of her rule. A hospital here secured the loyalty of a town. A new bridge there facilitated trade and the movement of her troops. Every act of charity was a public declaration of her power and benevolence, meant to be seen and celebrated by her subjects. This was the calculated side of medieval piety. Elinor understood that generosity was a currency, and she spent it to build alliances, pacify restless regions, and secure the prayers that would protect her soul for eternity. Her life forces us to ask a difficult question. Was her charity a genuine expression of faith, or was it the ultimate tool of a master politician? The truth likely lies in the medieval mind itself, where the health of the realm, the fate of the soul, and the exercise of power were not separate concerns, but different facets of a single, divine reality. In Elinor's hands, a gift to a monastery was as strategic as a treaty, and a prayer for the poor was an investment in a kingdom that would endure long after she was gone. While Elinor used wealth to build an empire, a young man in Italy was about to set it all on fire. Francis Bernardone, the son of a wealthy cloth merchant, stood naked in the town square of Assisi, handing his fine clothes back to his furious father. He declared that from that day forward, he had only one father in heaven. This was not a calculated political move. It was a complete and total rupture from the material world. Francis embraced a poverty so absolute, it was itself a form of almsgiving. He was not just giving away his possessions, he was giving away his very self, becoming one with the poor he sought to serve. His mission was to rebuild the church, not with stone and mortar, but with living acts of humility and love. He and his small band of brothers, the first Franciscans, owned nothing. They worked for their food or begged for it, accepting alms not as administrators, but as fellow beggars. This was a revolutionary concept. The almoner had become the alm. His famous sermon to the birds was not an eccentricity. It was the ultimate expression of his worldview. He preached to them as his sisters, seeing a divine spark in every living creature. For Francis, the entire world was his congregation, and every act of kindness, whether towards a human or a sparrow, was a prayer. This radical inclusivity extended to lepers, whom he kissed, and to social outcasts, whom he treated as brothers. He did not just serve the poor, he became poor, erasing the line between the giver and the receiver. This new model of a mobile, mendicant friar sent shockwaves through the medieval church. Here was a man with no cathedral, no land, and no treasury, commanding immense moral authority simply by the power of his example. The established church, with its vast wealth and political power, watched with a mixture of awe and deep suspicion. How could a church built on property and patronage accommodate a man who claimed that owning anything was a sin? Francis' movement sparked a fierce controversy. Was this pure, apostolic poverty the true path, or was it a dangerous rejection of the social order that sustained Christendom? The Franciscans became a new kind of almoner, one who traveled the roads, dependent on the charity of others, yet offering a spiritual richness that no castle could contain. They fundamentally changed religious life, proving that the greatest power could sometimes be found not in distributing wealth, but in surrendering it completely. While Francis of Assisi was embracing radical poverty, another kind of devotion was unfolding in the royal courts of England. King Henry III carried his piety not as a burden, but as a magnificent obsession. He was a man of profound and often extravagant devotion, whose personal almsgiving became a daily spectacle of royal virtue. Every morning, without fail, he would personally distribute food and coins to a long line of the poor who gathered at his palace gates. This was not a task he delegated, it was a ritual he cherished, a direct connection between the crown and the most vulnerable of his subjects. On major religious feast days, this generosity swelled to an immense scale. He would order great feasts for the poor, personally serving 500 paupers at a time, washing their feet in a powerful imitation of his saintly predecessor, King Louis IX of France. For Henry, this was the very definition of sacred kingship, a performance of humility meant to secure divine favor for himself and his realm. But his most enduring legacy of charity was not written on the faces of the poor. It was carved in stone. He poured his heart and his treasury into the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, transforming it from a modest Norman church into the breathtaking Gothic masterpiece we know today. He dedicated colossal sums to this project, funding the intricate stonework, the soaring arches, and the radiant stained glass, envisioning the abbey as a national shrine worthy of his patron saint, Edward the Confessor. This was almsgiving on a monumental scale, a permanent offering to God that would stand for centuries. Yet this river of gold, flowing from the royal coffers, had severe consequences. Henry's boundless generosity, both to the poor and to the abbey, placed an immense and constant strain on the royal treasury. He was funding his piety with money that was also needed to govern the kingdom, to pay soldiers, and to maintain fortifications. His barons, the powerful nobles of England, watched with growing alarm as their king seemed more concerned with buying his way into heaven than with managing the practical affairs of state. The very charity that was meant to demonstrate his strength as a pious monarch was, in fact, revealing a critical weakness in his financial and political judgment. The tension between the king's devotional spending and the barons' demands for fiscal responsibility became a central fault line in his reign. This pious generosity, so laudable in the eyes of the church, directly contributed to the political crises that would eventually lead to the barons' wars, a direct challenge to his authority. The story of King Henry III poses a difficult question. Where is the line between virtuous charity and irresponsible extravagance? His life stands as a powerful testament to the fact that in the medieval world, even the most sincere acts of mercy could carry a devastating political price, proving that an almoner king could feed the souls of the poor while starving the strength of his own crown. While King Henry strained his treasury with grand gestures, a different kind of power was cultivated in a German convent. Hildegard of Bingen heard a divine voice, a living light that instructed her not just to pray, but to heal. As the abbess of Rupertsberg, she was the chief almoner for her entire community, a role that extended far beyond distributing bread. Her charity was a holistic mission, treating the body and the soul as one. She transformed her convent into a center of medical care, using her extensive knowledge of herbal medicine to treat the sick who came to her gates. For Hildegard, a poultice for a fever or a tonic for pain was not merely a physical remedy. It was a sacred act of compassion, a way to restore a person to a state where they could better perceive the divine. Her famous work, Physica, is a comprehensive study of the natural world, detailing the healing properties of plants, animals, and stones. This was her almoner's ledger, a guide to using God's creation for charitable works. She saw the entire world as a pharmacy, and her duty was to administer its cures with wisdom and grace. Her visionary experiences were the engine of this charity. The same divine light that revealed theological mysteries also illuminated the intricate connections between humors, herbs, and health. She did not separate her mystical life from her practical duties. Instead, she believed her charitable works were a direct fulfillment of her divine calling. Managing the convent's resources required a shrewd and practical mind. She secured lucrative land grants and privileges, ensuring a steady flow of income not just for her nuns, but for the entire network of dependents who relied on the convent's charity. She balanced the books with the same fervor she applied to her prayers, understanding that effective mercy required a solid foundation of grain, wine, and coin. Her care for the surrounding Rhineland community was an extension of her care for her spiritual daughters, creating a self-sustaining ecosystem of faith and charity. Hildegard presents a unique mystery. How could one person be a visionary composer, a theological writer, a scientific pioneer, and a practical almoner? For her, there was no contradiction. Composing celestial music for her nuns was an act of spiritual nourishment, just as preparing a healing salve for a peasant was an act of physical grace. In her world, the distribution of medicine was as holy as the distribution of the sacraments, and the management of a convent's wealth was a divine stewardship, proving that an almoner's influence could flow as powerfully through a garden of herbs as through a king's treasury. Thomas Becket dined on gold plates, his table laden with delicacies from across the kingdom. As Chancellor of England, He was King Henry II's closest friend and most trusted official, a man who embodied the opulence and power of the royal court. His robes were of the finest silk, his feasts were legendary, and his generosity was that of a prince, dispensing favors and funds to secure loyalty and display the king's boundless wealth. He was the perfect servant to a formidable monarch, a partnership built on ambition and a shared vision of royal authority. Then, in a move that shocked the nation, King Henry engineered Becket's appointment as Archbishop of Canterbury. The king expected his loyal chancellor to remain just that, a loyal chancellor who would now also wear a mitre, seamlessly extending the crown's control over the powerful English church. But the moment Becket assumed that sacred office, a profound and startling transformation occurred. He resigned the chancellorship, trading his silks for a coarse monastic habit worn against his skin beneath his archbishop's robes. The lavish feast ceased, replaced by a simple diet of bread and water. The gold plates were stored away, and in their place, a new daily ritual began. Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, personally washed the feet of 13 poor men every single day, offering them not just cleansing, but a humble meal and alms from the Archbishop's own revenues. This was not a minor adjustment, it was a complete and public renunciation of his former life. His charity became as extravagant as his courtly spending had once been. He opened the episcopal palaces to the poor and the sick, turning them into hospices. He gave vast sums from the church treasury to leper houses and monasteries, channeling the wealth of his see directly to the most destitute. This dramatic shift was a direct challenge to the king. Henry had wanted a pliable archbishop who would put the crown's interests first, but he got a fiercely independent primate who now believed his sole duty was to God and the defense of the church's rights. The very alms Becket distributed became a symbol of this defiance. When Henry sought to assert control over church lands and revenues, Becket refused, arguing that this wealth was dedicated to God and the poor, not to the king's treasury. The almsgiving that defined his spiritual rebirth was, in the king's eyes, a misuse of funds that rightfully belonged to the state. Each beggar fed with the archbishop's bread was a living testament to Becket's new allegiance, a daily reminder that he no longer served his king, but a higher power. This conflict over the source and purpose of charity escalated into a bitter and public feud, culminating in those fateful words from Henry, spoken in a rage, that sent 4 knights racing to Canterbury Cathedral. There, before the altar, they murdered the archbishop, scattering his brains upon the stone floor. His martyrdom was the direct result of his transformation, a transformation whose most visible and politically charged act was his radical, uncompromising charity. In the end, the alms he gave did not buy him safety, but they did buy him sainthood, forever linking the distribution of bread with the ultimate price of defiance. The blood of a martyr sanctifies the stone, but the quiet defiance of a woman can build a new kind of sanctuary. While Thomas Becket's dramatic stand ended at the altar, a very different revolution was taking root in the Italian countryside, led by a young noblewoman named Clare. She heard Francis of Assisi preach and saw in his radical poverty not a threat, but a calling. She left her wealthy family under the cover of night, and in a tiny chapel, Francis himself cut her long hair and gave her a rough penitent's habit. This was her irrevocable break, a vow not just to God, but to a life of total dependence. She founded the Order of Poor Ladies, later known as the Poor Clares, and their rule was one of breathtaking severity. They would own nothing, not even as a community. Their survival would depend entirely on the alms given by the people of Assisi, the very alms that Francis and his friars begged for daily. This created a profound spiritual ecosystem. The friars went out to beg, and they brought what they received to the enclosed sisters at San Damiano. The sisters, in turn, would share this meager sustenance amongst themselves and with any poor person who came to their gate. They were not just recipients of charity, they were its conduit, transforming the bread they were given into a sacred offering for others. Their entire existence was a lesson in trust, a daily gamble that God would provide for their needs through the kindness of strangers. This complete reliance on alms was the very heart of their identity, a constant, living prayer of need and gratitude. The great mystery of Clare's life was her fierce, decades-long battle to secure what she called the privilege of poverty. Church authorities, uncomfortable with such absolute destitution, repeatedly tried to force her order to accept land and endowments, to live under a more conventional, secure monastic rule. Clare refused. She argued that to own property was to betray the very essence of her calling, to mimic Christ and his apostles who had no place to lay their heads. Her campaign was one of relentless letters and petitions to the Pope. Finally, on her deathbed, she received the official papal bull guaranteeing that her order would never be compelled to own property. This was her ultimate victory. The privilege of poverty was not a grant of wealth, but a grant of the right to remain perfectly poor, to make almsgiving the unbreakable foundation of their lives. In a world where power was measured in land and treasure, Clare of Assisi wielded a different kind of influence, the authority of total surrender, proving that the most powerful fortress could be built not with walls, but with an open, empty hand. The echo of Clare's empty hand finds its answer in the regal halls of England, where a king's touch was said to cure the sick. Edward, known to history as the Confessor, was the last Anglo-Saxon king of the ancient House of Wessex, a ruler whose legacy is built less on battle and more on an aura of profound, almost otherworldly piety. His reign was defined by a peace that seemed miraculous in a violent age, and his personal charity was the cornerstone of his sanctity. He did not merely give from his treasury, he gave from a deep well of personal devotion, distributing alms on a scale that became legendary. But his most enduring gift to history was not the coins he handed to beggars. It was the great church he built beside the Thames, the Abbey of Westminster. He envisioned it as a royal church, a place of coronations and royal burials, and he poured his resources into its construction, creating a monument that would forever link the English crown with divine favor. This was almsgiving in stone, a permanent act of devotion meant to outlast any single king. The legends that grew around him, however, revolved around a more intimate power, his alleged ability to heal scrofula, a disfiguring tubercular infection of the lymph nodes known as the king's evil. The touch of his hand, it was said, could cure this affliction, a divine gift that confirmed his status as God's anointed. This was the ultimate alms, a charitable act that required no gold, only the sacred authority of the royal person. But how much of this saintly reputation was truly Edward's own, and how much was crafted after his death? When the Normans conquered England in 1066, they faced the immense task of legitimizing their rule over a defeated people. A usurper like William the Conqueror needed a powerful symbol of continuity, a way to claim he was the rightful heir to a holy throne. The memory of Edward the Confessor became that symbol. The Normans vigorously promoted his cult, emphasizing his piety, his charity, and his healing touch to present their new dynasty as the natural successors to a saint. His reign was reframed not as the end of Anglo-Saxon England, but as a golden age of peace and piety that the Normans were destined to continue and protect. The very alms Edward gave, and the abbey he founded, were posthumously enlisted in a campaign of political propaganda, proving that even the most sincere charity could be repurposed by history, its meaning reshaped to serve the needs of new rulers who saw in a saintly king the ultimate key to their own legitimacy. Peter the Venerable presided over a river of gold flowing into the Abbey of Cluny. As the abbot of the wealthiest and most influential monastic order in 12th century Europe, his desk was not just a place of prayer, but the nerve center of a vast charitable empire. The network of Cluniac houses stretched from Spain to the Holy Land, each one generating income from lands, tithes, and the pious donations of kings and peasants alike. Peter's duty was to channel this immense fortune into alms on a truly continental scale, feeding the poor, sheltering pilgrims, and supporting thousands of dependents. This was charity as a corporate enterprise, managed with the precision of a modern CEO, yet driven by a sacred mandate to turn wealth into grace. But how does a man reconcile such immense earthly power with a vow of poverty? His answer was a lifelong campaign to reform the very system that gave him that power. He saw the spiritual dangers in Cluny's opulence, the creeping worldliness that threatened the order's soul. He fought to curb excesses and refocus his monks on their spiritual duties, believing that true charity must flow from a pure heart, or it was merely a transaction. This reforming zeal, however, did not make him withdraw from the world. In a move of breathtaking intellectual courage, he commissioned the first ever Latin translation of the Quran. He did not do this to understand Islam, but to refute it, believing that to defeat an enemy, you must first know his arguments. This project reveals the complex mind of the medieval almoner. The same administrative skill that distributed bread to the poor was also used to manage a team of translators, funding a work of scholarship meant to defend Christendom. For Peter, defending the faith through intellectual combat was another form of charity. A spiritual almsgiving meant to save souls from error. His life presents a profound contradiction. He was a reformer who led a lavish institution, a distributor of alms who funded polemical warfare, a monk who wielded more influence than most kings. He demonstrates that the highest levels of medieval charity were never just about kindness. They were about stewardship on a grand scale, where feeding a beggar and translating a holy book were two sides of the same coin, both essential to building a world ordered by faith. A queen's daily bread was a ritual of humility, served before her own. St. Margaret of Scotland, an English princess by birth and a Scottish queen by marriage, structured her entire day around the needs of the poor. Each morning, she would rise before dawn to pray, and then, before breaking her own fast, she would personally supervise the feeding of 24 commoners. She did not stop there. She sought out orphans, washing their feet and providing them with food and care, treating these forgotten children as if they were her own royal offspring. This was not an occasional act of charity performed for show. It was the fundamental rhythm of her life, a constant reminder that her crown was a burden of service, not a license for privilege. Her piety was as strategic as it was sincere, helping to soften the edges of her husband, King Malcolm III, a warrior king known for his rough manners, and presenting their court as a center of civilized and godly rule. But her compassion was not confined to the castle walls. She looked beyond her immediate circle to the struggles of ordinary people, particularly the pilgrims who traveled to the holy sites of Scotland. These devout travelers faced a treacherous obstacle, the wide and dangerous tidal waters of the Firth of Forth. To cross, they had to rely on expensive and often unreliable boatmen, a journey that could be fatal. Moved by their plight, Queen Margaret used her own resources to establish a free ferry service, a charitable crossing that would safely carry pilgrims to their destination without cost. This single act of practical mercy sparked something far greater than she could have imagined. A small settlement grew around the landing point on the southern shore, a place where ferrymen and their families lived, where inns and chapels were built to serve the constant flow of travelers. This humble settlement, founded on the Queen's charity, eventually grew into the town we know today as South Queensferry, its very name a permanent monument to her generosity. Her almsgiving, therefore, did more than fill empty stomachs. It literally reshaped the map, creating a new community and a lasting infrastructure of mercy that endured for centuries. Her story asks us to consider the ripple effect of a single compassionate act, and how a queen's decision to feed an orphan or fund a boatman could, over time, build a town and anchor her name in the very geography of a nation. The clash of empires often begins with a simple question: who holds the true power to forgive sins, a king or a pope? Pope Gregory VII stood at the center of this firestorm, a man whose very name became a battle cry in the investiture controversy. His life's work was a radical attempt to purify the church, to rip it from the grasping hands of secular rulers who sold bishoprics like trinkets and appointed corrupt nobles as shepherds of souls. He believed with every fiber of his being that the church must be free from worldly control to fulfill its sacred mission, and that mission included a solemn, non-negotiable duty to the poor. For Gregory, charity was not a sideline activity for the church. It was a core function, a direct command from Christ himself. But here lies the profound paradox of his reign. To protect the church's spiritual mission, including its care for the poor, he believed he first had to seize immense temporal power. His famous Dictatus Papae was a breathtaking declaration of papal supremacy, asserting the Pope's authority to depose emperors and that all princes should kiss his feet. This was not the language of a humble servant. but of a spiritual monarch claiming dominion over the entire world. He fought Emperor Henry IV not with armies, but with excommunications and interdicts, weapons that could paralyze a kingdom and starve its people of sacraments. This was a war fought with souls as the currency, and within this grand struggle, his reforms extended directly to almsgiving. Gregory worked to centralize the distribution of charity, bringing it under the disciplined control of the papal court. He understood that the wealth of the church was its lifeblood for mercy, and that this wealth must be managed by the clergy, not diverted by kings for their own purposes. He systematized the collection and distribution of alms, turning the Lateran Palace into a hub of organized relief, ensuring that funds meant for the poor actually reached them, rather than lining the pockets of a secular lord. So we are left with a difficult puzzle. Was Pope Gregory VII a champion of the poor, or a power-hungry politician in clerical robes? The answer is that he was likely both, a man who saw no distinction between the two. In his mind, a weak pope meant a corrupt church, and a corrupt church would inevitably neglect its duty to the destitute. His fight for political supremacy was, in his eyes, the necessary precondition for effective, godly charity. He could not feed the sheep if he did not first control the pasture. This tension between spiritual humility and raw political will define his tumultuous reign, a reign that reshaped the map of Europe and redefined the very meaning of mercy as an instrument of power. A firestorm over papal power could rage for generations, but it required a mind of immense clarity to build a lasting foundation for mercy. Centuries after Gregory's battles, a quiet Dominican friar named Thomas Aquinas would provide exactly that, drafting an intellectual architecture for charity that would endure for centuries. He sat in his cell, not amidst grand political intrigues, but surrounded by parchment and ink, and within his monumental Summa Theologica, he dissected the very soul of almsgiving. He defined charity not as a simple emotion or a passing whim, but as a theological virtue, a habit of the will directed toward God and, by extension, toward one's neighbor. For Aquinas, giving alms was an act of justice, a restoration of a divine order where resources were meant to be shared. This was charity with a philosophical backbone, an obligation rooted in the nature of God and the purpose of human society. His most impactful and practical teaching revolved around the concept of surplus. He argued that while individuals had a right to what they needed to sustain their own life and station, everything beyond that, the surplus, belonged by right to the poor. To hoard excess wealth while others starved was not merely stinginess, it was a form of theft. The man with a full storehouse and a neighbor with an empty stomach was, in the eyes of God, withholding what was not rightfully his to keep. This was a radical idea wrapped in calm, logical prose. It provided a clear, moral calculus for the wealthy, from the merchant in his counting house to the queen in her treasury. How much was truly enough? Aquinas gave them a spiritual answer with profound social consequences. His framework did more than justify giving, it systematized it. He categorized different types of alms, from the spiritual, like instructing the ignorant, to the corporal, like feeding the hungry. He discussed the proper intentions behind giving, prioritizing the anonymous gift over the public donation made for praise. This intellectual structure was eagerly adopted by the very kings and clerics who managed the era's vast charitable networks. It gave them a language to explain their duties, a moral justification for their distributions, and a way to assess their own souls. When a monarch funded a hospital or a bishop endowed a leper house, they were not just performing a random act of kindness. They were participating in a divine economy laid out by the great theologian. Aquinas provided the ethical operating system for medieval mercy, transforming the impulsive gift into a deliberate act of justice, and ensuring that the question of surplus would echo in the conscience of the powerful long after his own voice fell silent. A king's mind could hold a universe of stars, laws, and sacred verses. Alfonso X of Castile, known to history as the Wise, saw his royal duty not just as a matter of sword and crown, but as a grand project of enlightenment. His court in 13th century Spain became a brilliant crossroads where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars worked side by side, translating astronomical tables and composing poetry. This was a monarch who looked to the heavens, yet his gaze remained fixed on the earthly suffering of his most vulnerable subjects. His personal piety was expressed through lavish almsgiving, a constant stream of coins and food flowing from his own hand to the poor who gathered at his palace. But Alfonso understood that a king's fleeting generosity was not enough to build a just society. True mercy, he believed, needed the unshakable foundation of law. This conviction led to his life's great work, a massive legal code known as the Siete Partidas, or the Seven Parts. Within its detailed passages, he did something extraordinary. He codified charity. The law explicitly declared that kings, above all others, had a solemn duty to protect and provide for the poor, the orphan, and the widow. It commanded churches to use a portion of their tithes to support local hospitals and to maintain a common chest for emergency relief. This was not merely a suggestion, it was a legal obligation, weaving the fabric of welfare directly into the structure of the state and the church. Alfonso's genius was this fusion of intellectual rigor and compassionate action. He blended his passion for astronomy with his devotion to justice, seeing both as reflections of a single, divine order. By turning the moral impulse of almsgiving into a written, enforceable statute, he created a system meant to outlive his own reign and his own personal charity. His work poses a fascinating question. Can a law truly compel compassion? Alfonso the Wise believed it could, and in doing so, he built a framework where mercy was not just a king's virtue, but a kingdom's permanent duty. A noblewoman's voice could command a king from across a continent. Birgitta of Sweden was no quiet contemplative. She was a political mystic whose private revelations became public mandates for justice. After the death of her husband, she exchanged her life at the royal court for a much higher calling, one delivered through visions of Christ and the Virgin Mary that were as detailed as they were demanding. These were not gentle meditations, they were fiery prophecies, dictated to her confessors and sent directly to the powers of her age. She fearlessly admonished popes in Avignon to return to Rome and end the church's corruption. She commanded kings to make peace and rule with compassion, warning them that their authority was a sacred trust, measured by their treatment of the poor. Her charity was not born from quiet reflection, but from a divine imperative that left no room for compromise. She believed that true reform began with the powerful realigning their hearts with the needs of the least of their subjects. To give alms was a holy act, but to build a system where justice prevailed was the ultimate form of charity. Her most enduring legacy was the fruit of these visions, the Brigittine order and its mother house at Vadstena. This was a double monastery, housing both monks and nuns in a unique community bound by a common rule of life. Vadstena was designed to be a spiritual powerhouse and a beacon of practical mercy. It became a major center for hospitality, a required stop for pilgrims where travelers could find food, shelter, and care regardless of their station. The monastery's economy was fueled by the surrounding lands Birgitta had secured, and its daily rhythm was a continuous cycle of prayer and service. The poor who came to its gates were not turned away. They were welcomed as Christ himself, their physical needs met as an expression of the community's deepest spiritual values. Birgitta's life forces a difficult question. Can a voice from the margins truly reshape the center of power? Her revelations, written down by a widowed noblewoman in a remote Scandinavian kingdom, echoed in the papal courts and royal chambers of Europe, proving that the most potent form of almsgiving might not be a coin, but a courageous word spoken directly to the conscience of a king. Bloodshed demands penance, and no king understood this better than William the Conqueror. The battlefield at Hastings was not merely a site of victory, it was a place of profound spiritual debt, stained with the lifeblood of thousands. To atone for this carnage and secure his own salvation, William made a monumental promise. He would build an abbey right where the fighting had been most fierce, its high altar marking the very spot where King Harold fell. This was the origin of Battle Abbey, a colossal endowment meant to wash away the sin of conquest with a river of prayer and stone. Monks were brought in to sing masses in perpetuity for the souls of the dead, both Norman and English, a continuous spiritual petition for divine forgiveness. But this act of charity was far more than a plea for mercy. It was a masterstroke of political theater. By planting a great Norman monastery at the heart of his new kingdom, William was physically claiming the land, transforming a symbol of English defeat into a permanent seat of Norman power and piety. The abbey was not hidden away. It was a prominent feature on the landscape, a daily reminder to the conquered English that their new king was not only a formidable warrior, but also a devout son of the church, whose rule was sanctioned by God himself. His charitable strategy extended far beyond this single foundation. William lavished wealth on other monasteries across England, from Canterbury to Durham, systematically replacing Anglo-Saxon abbots with loyal Normans. Each new endowment was a carefully placed anchor, tying the Norman regime to the sacred institutions of the land. This was charity as a tool of conquest and consolidation, a way to legitimize a usurper's throne by demonstrating both remorse and divine favor. The great mystery of William's almsgiving lies in its dual nature. Was he a genuinely penitent man seeking grace for his violent ascent, or was he a calculating ruler using the language of piety to cement his control? The truth likely lives in the medieval mind, where the health of the soul and the security of the state were inseparable. Every stone laid at Battle Abbey served both a spiritual and a political master, proving that in the aftermath of a conquest, the most powerful weapon could sometimes be a gift to God. While the Franciscans embraced radical poverty, a new storm was brewing in the south of France, one that demanded a different kind of weapon. A Spanish priest named Dominic de Guzman walked through the region of Languedoc and saw not just poverty, but a crisis of the mind. The Cathar heresy was spreading like wildfire, its followers rejecting the material world and the authority of the church. Dominic understood that to fight an idea, you needed a better idea. He would not just feed empty stomachs, he would feed hungry minds. His mission gave birth to the order of preachers, the Dominicans, and their approach to charity was as intellectual as it was compassionate. The Dominicans were mendicants, just like the Franciscans, owning no property and relying entirely on alms for their own survival. But the purpose of those alms was fundamentally different. For Dominic, the greatest charity was the salvation of a soul, and that salvation came through preaching and teaching. The alms they received were not merely for their daily bread, they were fuel for a mission of education. They used charitable donations to fund their studies, to build libraries, and to travel to university towns, transforming alms into intellectual capital. This created a powerful new model. The Dominicans became the great educators of the High Middle Ages, establishing themselves at the heart of emerging universities like Paris and Oxford. They were not secluded in remote monasteries. They were in the bustling urban centers, engaging in public debates, preaching in the vernacular, and offering spiritual guidance grounded in deep learning. Their charity was the distribution of truth. They provided a different path for those drawn to religious life, one that valued a well-stocked mind as much as an empty purse. The contrast with the Franciscans was striking. Francis saw poverty as the ultimate good in itself, a mystical marriage to Lady Poverty. For Dominic, poverty was a practical tool, a means to an end. It allowed his friars to be mobile, credible, and free from the corrupting influence of wealth, so they could more effectively combat heresy and educate the masses. Both orders relied on alms, but one used them to embody destitution, while the other used them to fund a war of ideas. The Dominicans also established their own networks of care, running hospices and distributing alms to the poor, but this was often integrated with their preaching. Feeding the body was a way to open a conversation with the soul. In Dominic's vision, a bowl of soup could be the first step toward understanding a complex point of theology. He created a complete ecosystem of mercy, where the alms given by the faithful were recycled into both physical sustenance and spiritual enlightenment, proving that charity could be as much about filling a mind with light as it was about filling a hand with bread. Empress Matilda's war chest was not just filled with silver and soldiers. It was filled with charters of donation to monasteries and promises of protection for the poor. As the daughter of King Henry I and the mother of the future Henry II, she was the pivotal figure in the brutal civil war known as the Anarchy, a 19-year struggle for the English throne against her cousin, King Stephen. In this world, a woman claiming a crown was an almost unthinkable act. a direct challenge to the very foundations of a society built on male authority. Her greatest weapon in this fight was not the sword, but the strategic distribution of charity, a campaign to prove her legitimacy through magnificent piety. She issued grants to key religious houses like Reading Abbey and the Priory of Holy Trinity in London, endowing them with lands and privileges. These were not random acts of devotion. They were political investments, securing the loyalty of the monks whose prayers and influence could sway public opinion, and, more importantly, the opinion of God. By positioning herself as their most generous patron, she was arguing that divine favor rested on her cause, not Stephen's. Her almsgiving was a public performance of sacred kingship, a quality no one could deny her, even if they denied her the crown based on her gender. She presented herself as a protector of the destitute, using charity to build a base of popular support in the cities and regions she controlled. Every loaf of bread given to a beggar in her name was a subtle piece of propaganda, a message that the empress, not the king, was the true source of justice and mercy in a kingdom ravaged by war. How does a woman rule when the world refuses to be ruled by a woman? Matilda's answer was to wield compassion as her scepter. She understood that in the economy of medieval power, generosity could purchase loyalty just as effectively as fear, and that the route to a contested throne might just be paved with charitable gifts. The same hands that gently tended the sick could also rally armies to a holy war. Bernard of Clairvaux was a man of profound contradictions, a Cistercian monk whose life was dedicated to the most austere spiritual peace, yet whose voice thundered across Europe, calling for a crusade. He entered the monastery of Citox as a young man, drawn to the Cistercian order's radical return to simplicity. This was a deliberate rejection of the worldly wealth and ornate rituals that had come to define monastic life at places like Cluny. The Cistercians sought out wild, unsettled lands, and their monks were both farmers and prayers. Their calloused hands a testament to the belief that manual labor was itself a form of worship. This commitment to humble work naturally extended to their charitable practices. Their charity was not grand or distant, it was local and practical. They worked the land not only to feed themselves, but to have a surplus to share with the poor in their region. A Cistercian almoner distributed bread made from grain his brothers had sown and harvested, a direct, tangible chain of mercy from their labor to a neighbor's need. Bernard, with his fiery intellect and magnetic eloquence, quickly rose to become the abbot of Clairvaux, and from that remote monastery, his influence became immense. Kings and popes sought his counsel, and his letters shaped the politics of Christendom. Then came the call that would define his legacy in blood. After the fall of the Crusader county of Edessa, Pope Eugene III turned to Bernard, the most respected holy man of the age, to preach a new crusade. How could a man devoted to peace become the primary trumpet for war? Bernard's answer lay in an expanded, militant concept of charity. For him, charity was not merely about feeding the hungry, it was about defending the entire body of Christ, the Church itself. To take up the cross and fight for the faith was, in his view, the ultimate act of love for one's Christian brothers and sisters in the East. It was a spiritual work of mercy, a form of almsgiving that offered not bread, but protection. His preaching tour for the Second Crusade was a phenomenon. Wherever he went, masses of people flocked to him, and so many men took the cross that, as one account claimed, Bernard ran out of cloth crosses to give them, tearing pieces from his own monastic habit to meet the demand. The crusade itself ended in catastrophic failure, a defeat that haunted Bernard for the rest of his life. He was forced to confront the terrible paradox he had created. He had preached a war of charity, only to see it devolve into a tragedy of suffering and death. In his later writings, he grappled with this, interpreting the failure as a divine punishment for the sins of the Crusaders, not a flaw in his own ideal. Bernard of Clairvaux thus embodies one of the most complex mysteries of the medieval almoner. Can a call to violence ever be an expression of charity? His life suggests that in the medieval mind, the two could be tragically intertwined, where the sword and the loaf of bread were both seen as instruments of a love so fierce it was willing to both sustain life and take it in the name of God. A king's charity could echo across continents, even in his absence. Richard the Lionheart spent only 6 months of his 10-year reign in England. his heart and sword committed to the battlefields of the Holy Land. Yet the distribution of alms in his name never ceased, managed by a sophisticated administrative machine he left behind. Justiciars and sheriffs acted as his proxies, drawing from the royal treasury to fund hospitals, monasteries, and daily doles to the poor. This was charity by royal decree, a continuous performance of piety meant to demonstrate that even a crusading king, thousands of miles away, remained the spiritual father of his people. His generosity was a ghostly presence, ensuring his subjects prayed for his success and his safe return, turning alms into a form of long-distance loyalty. The crusade itself was framed as the ultimate act of charity. Preachers across Europe declared that supporting such a holy war was a spiritual duty, a work of mercy that helped reclaim Christ's patrimony and protect fellow Christians from persecution. Donations poured in not just from royal coffers, but from nobles and commoners alike, all seeking a share in the spiritual rewards. Richard's own fundraising was legendary, infamously declaring he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. This blurred the line between piety and politics completely. The alms given to support his crusade were not merely for the poor of England. They were fuel for a holy war that served his personal glory and the strategic interests of Christendom. Every prayer purchased by a charitable donation, every coin given to a monastery to intercede for his victory, linked the humble act of almsgiving directly to the grand clash of empires. His reign presents a stark question. Can a king truly be charitable when his primary act of charity is waged with a sword? For Richard the Lionheart, the distribution of bread at home and the shedding of blood abroad were two sides of the same sacred coin, both spent in the relentless pursuit of a heavenly reward. Catherine of Siena met her divine bridegroom not in a cathedral, but in the small, bare room of her family home. A vision of Christ appeared to her, placing a ring on her finger that was visible only to her, a symbol of their mystical marriage. This was no quiet spiritual retreat. It was the ignition of a force of nature. Her profound asceticism became the furnace of her charity. She lived on barely any food, sometimes consuming only a handful of herbs, believing that her true sustenance came from serving Christ in the suffering bodies of the sick. She sought out the most repulsive cases in Siena's hospitals, those afflicted with cancers and leprosy, whose wounds drove others away. With her own hands, she would clean their sores and dress their ulcers, seeing in every festering wound the sacred stigmata of her beloved. Her service was a physical prayer, a direct and visceral communion with the divine through the most wretched of human conditions. Yet this woman who embraced such intimate filth also wielded a pen that could shake the foundations of Europe. From her humble cell, she dictated a flood of letters to kings, queens, and popes, her words burning with a fierce urgency. She commanded the Pope himself, Gregory XI, to abandon the corruption of Avignon and return the papacy to Rome, framing this political act as a supreme work of charity and justice for the entire body of the Church. She did not politely suggest. She demanded that rulers govern with compassion, reminding them that their power was a trust from God to be used for the good of the poor. How could a laywoman, a dyer's daughter with no formal education, command such authority? Her influence flowed directly from the authenticity of her radical life. When she told a cardinal to be more generous or a queen to be more just, they could not dismiss her as a hypocrite. They knew she had given everything, even the basic comfort of food, for the very principles she preached. Her personal piety was not a private devotion, but a spring of political power that cascaded across the continent, proving that the most potent charity could begin with a single, determined woman washing the feet of the forgotten. Even a poet's pen could dissect the soul of a medieval almoner. Geoffrey Chaucer, a courtier and customs official, never held the title himself, but in his Canterbury Tales, he wielded a far more potent tool, the power of satirical observation. His pilgrimage frame is a vibrant tapestry of late 14th century England, and woven into its threads is a devastating critique of a charitable system grown corrupt. The most chilling portrait is that of the pardoner, a man who makes a lucrative living by preying on the pious fears of ordinary people. He travels with a bag of worthless trinkets he claims are holy relics. A pillowcase, he says, was the veil of the Virgin Mary. A piece of sail he swears came from St. Peter's boat. He sells these fake objects and, more insidiously, he sells indulgences, official-looking documents that promise to shorten a person's time in purgatory in exchange for a cash donation. This was almsgiving twisted into a spiritual shakedown, where charity was no longer about compassion, but about purchasing divine favor from a charlatan. The pardoner is a master of psychological manipulation. He begins his sermons in churches with a haunting phrase, radix malorem est cupiditas. Latin for greed is the root of all evil. He then proceeds to terrify his congregation with vivid descriptions of the torments of hell, only to immediately offer them a convenient, monetary escape from that very fate. He boasts openly about his own avarice, declaring that his only intention is to gain money, not to correct sin. Chaucer is holding up a mirror to a widespread sickness in the system. The pardoner is not an isolated monster. He is a symptom of a church apparatus that had commodified salvation, creating a class of unregulated officials who turned mercy into a transaction. What does this satire reveal about the public's view of charity? It shows a deep and growing skepticism. The faithful were not naive. They could see the gap between the ideal of selfless giving and the reality of greedy takers. The pardoner's own tale, a grim story about 3 rioters who find death while seeking it, serves as a perfect metaphor for his own hollow mission. He preaches against the very greed that defines him, creating a dizzying cycle of hypocrisy that his fellow pilgrims recognize and despise. Yet, and this is Chaucer's most brilliant point, they still buy his pardons and touch his fake relics when he is done. This is the complex reality of medieval motivation. Even when people suspected the system was corrupt, the fear of damnation was so powerful that they felt compelled to participate, to pay the fee just in case the promise was real. Chaucer's work does not dismiss the value of true charity, but it ruthlessly exposes its counterfeit. He forces us to ask where the line falls between a genuine gift to God and a desperate payment to a conman, revealing that in the shadowy economy of salvation, even the most sacred acts of mercy could be forged. A new kind of challenge to the church was brewing not on a battlefield, but within the quiet halls of Oxford University. The theologian John Wycliffe looked at the vast estates and golden reliquaries of the clergy and saw a profound betrayal. He argued that the true church was not this wealthy institution, but the invisible community of those predestined for heaven, and that its wealth was a corrupting poison. For Wycliffe, the entire system of medieval almsgiving was built on a lie. How could a church drowning in luxury truly perform the works of mercy Christ commanded? His answer was as radical as it was simple. He believed the church's immense property, its manors and forests and treasure, should be forcibly taken by the state and redistributed for the direct benefit of the poor. This was not a call for reform from within. It was a demand for a revolutionary transfer of wealth, appending 1,000 years of tradition. His most enduring assault on the church's authority, however, came from his belief that every person should have access to God's word. He and his followers, known as Lollards, undertook the dangerous work of translating the Bible from Latin into English. This act was itself a form of supreme charity, a spiritual alms giving the bread of Scripture directly to the hungry laity, bypassing the need for a priestly interpreter. For this, the Church declared him a heretic. His ideas questioned the very engine of institutional charity. If the Pope and bishops were not the sole distributors of divine grace, and if their wealth was illegitimate, then the entire economy of salvation, where the rich donated to monasteries to save their souls, collapsed. Wycliffe's voice, though condemned, could not be silenced. His arguments became a seed, planted deep in the soil of discontent, that would one day erupt across Europe as the Reformation, forever changing what it meant to give, to receive, and to find a path to God. The fire of reform lit by Wycliffe in England crossed the Channel and found dry tinder in Bohemia. A priest named Jan Hus stood in the Bethlehem Chapel in Prague, preaching in the Czech language to a captivated public. He held up Wycliffe's writings not as heresy, but as a mirror, forcing his congregation to see the stark reflection of a church that had lost its way. From his pulpit, he launched a relentless attack on the moral rot he saw everywhere. He denounced bishops who lived like princes and priests who sold sacraments for profit, arguing that their obsession with wealth made them incapable of true spiritual leadership. Their very existence, he claimed, was a betrayal of the apostolic life, a life defined by poverty and service, for whose a clergy drowning in gold could never extend a genuine hand of charity to the poor. His sermons transformed the concept of almsgiving from a simple duty into a revolutionary litmus test. True charity, he argued, was impossible without a pure church. The immense wealth hoarded by the clergy was not theirs to keep. It was stolen from the poor, and every gilded relic was a monument to this theft. This message resonated deeply with the common people of Bohemia, who saw their own poverty sharpened by the opulence of their spiritual shepherds. Huss' religious movement, Hussitism, quickly fused theology with social justice. The demand for a poor church was also a demand for a just society. His followers, armed with these ideas, began to seize church properties, redistracting the land and its wealth to the local communities. This was not mere looting, it was a theological act, a practical implementation of what they saw as rightful almsgiving. The chalice became their powerful symbol, representing their demand that all believers, not just the clergy, should receive both the bread and the wine during communion. This was a fight for spiritual equality that mirrored their fight for economic justice. The Church and the Holy Roman Emperor could not tolerate such a challenge. Hus was summoned to the Council of Constance, promised safe passage, and then betrayed. He was arrested, tried for heresy, and condemned. The authorities offered him a simple choice: recant his words and live, or hold fast to them and die. He refused to deny what he believed was the truth. On July 6, 1415, he was stripped of his priestly robes, led to a stake outside the city walls, and burned alive. His executioners shoved his ashes into the Rhine River, hoping to erase his memory forever, but martyrdom only magnified his message. The flames that consumed his body ignited a revolution in Bohemia, sparking the Hussite Wars, where his followers took up arms to defend their right to a faith that served the poor. Jan Hus' story demonstrates the ultimate political power of an idea about charity. He proved that a sermon calling for apostolic poverty could shake empires, and that a demand for rightful almsgiving could be so dangerous, it had to be answered with fire. For every queen who washed the feet of lepers, there were 100 unnamed hands that carried the water. Behind every king's grand charitable decree stood a silent army of ordinary men and women who did the actual work of mercy. These were the anonymous Almoners, the faceless backbone of a system built on daily acts of compassion. Their stories are etched not in chronicles, but in the simple, repetitive rhythm of need met with kindness. Before the sun had fully risen, a monk might be found at the monastery gate, his sleeves dusted with flour, handing out loaves of coarse bread to a line of quiet, waiting poor. In a cramped hospital ward, a woman with no title would patiently change the bandages on a leper's wounds, her face a mask of calm concentration amidst the smell of sickness and herbs. At a crossroads, a lay brother offered a tired pilgrim a place to sleep and a bowl of thin pottage, asking for nothing but a prayer in return. This was the unglamorous machinery of medieval charity, powered not by a desire for political influence or heavenly reward, but by a simple, profound understanding that a person was hungry, or sick, or lost, and that they could help. Their impact is almost impossible to measure, for it was written in lives quietly saved from despair. A child who survived the winter because of a daily ration of bread, a traveler who found strength to continue his journey because of a single night's shelter, a sick man who died with a measure of dignity because someone was willing to sit with him in the dark. They formed a vast, invisible network of care that caught people when they fell, a social safety net woven one thread at a time by people whose names we will never know. The true mystery of the medieval almoner is not found in the dramatic stories of saints and kings, but here, in the quiet accumulation of 1,000,000 forgotten gestures. How many lives were shaped, how many destinies altered, by a piece of bread given without any record, by a kind word spoken without any witness. Their compassion became the quiet, resilient heartbeat of an entire age, a testament to the fact that the most powerful force in history is often the one that leaves no trace behind. From princesses hiding bread to queens washing feet, the stories of these 30 almoners reveal a world where charity was a complex currency of power and faith. Each figure, whether a king like Louis IX or a mystic like Catherine of Siena, used the distribution of alms as a tool to build loyalty, secure salvation, and shape the very fabric of their society. Their generosity was never just about kindness. It was a strategic force woven into the political and spiritual battles of their age, a mysterious dance between humble service and immense influence. This medieval legacy of organized mercy laid the groundwork for our modern concepts of social responsibility, planting the idea that caring for the vulnerable is a fundamental duty, whether commanded by a king, a pope, or one's own conscience. So we turn the question to you. Which of these almoners captured your imagination the most? Was it the defiant Thomas Becket, the radical Francis of Assisi, or the politically shrewd Eleanor of Aquitaine? Let us know in the comments, and if you have other enigmatic figures from history you would like us to explore, tell us there as well. For more deep dives into the hidden stories of the past, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel.